In the year 1874, the most dangerous place in the United States wasn't the western frontier stalked by outlaws. It was 2,800 feet beneath the rolling green hills of Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, where the coal glittered like black diamonds, and the air itself was a patient, waiting assassin. To descend into the mammoth mine was to step out of the sunlit, optimistic promise of the American dream and into a dark, suffocating reality, ruled not by law or God, but by the whim of a single man, Franklin B. Gowen, president of the Reading Railroad and master of the Coal Kingdom. And down in that subterranean hell, where the walls wept cold water and the timbers groaned, men began to talk in hushed Gaelic, drawn on an old secret tradition from the bogs of Ireland to survive. They knew the price of silence was death, but the price of speaking up might be the same, only swifter and cleaner. Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, November 1874. The smell of the cage was a sharp metallic tang of iron, rust, and damp sweat. It was barely 5 in the morning, and the world above was still wrapped in a layer of biting, freezing fog. Tiernan O'Connell, 21 years old and already marked by a decade of work in the mines, pushed his shoulder against the rough wool of the man next to him. They were packed tight, 15 men to a narrow 4-sided iron elevator, the man cage, a vessel whose only purpose was to deliver human bodies to the underworld and, if they were lucky, return them, shattered but breathing, 10 hours later. Tiernan didn't look up. No one did. To look up into the oily spinning cable in the gaping darkness of the mine shaft above was to invite a cold dread that could paralyze a man faster than the black lung. He kept his gaze fixed on the tallow lamp affixed to his battered leather cap, its light barely strong enough to hold back the encroaching night. "They dropped the rates again, Tiernan," whispered Seamus, the older man next to him, his breath fogging the air. Seamus was Tiernan's closest kin in America, a veteran of the horrific famine crossings who had sought refuge in the Pennsylvania coal patch. Tiernan tightened his grip on the handle of his pickaxe. "The ton rate?" "Aye, 2 cents. Gowen's men posted the notice last night. Another 2 cents. They say the soft coal competition is driving the prices down. Lies. They say the same thing when the sun is shining and the coal houses are full. It's just another pound of flesh for the Reading Railroad. The anthracite coal they mined, the hard, clean, burning rock that fueled the furnaces, factories, and homes of America's booming industrial East, was the most valuable mineral on the continent. Its transportation was monopolized by the iron fist of the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company, which was in turn controlled by the powerful and ruthless Franklin B. Gowen. Gowen owned the mines, the tracks, the company stores, and, effectively, the police. The miners were not just employees, they were chattel, bound by the pluck-me system of the company-owned store, the company patch, where wages were paid in scrip, ensuring every penny returned directly to the corporation. Clang! The sudden, deafening sound of the cage hitting the shaft floor 1,500 feet below jarred Tiernan's bones. The men stumbled out into the damp, chill air of the gangway, the main artery of the mine. Here, the air was still relatively breathable, pumped down from above, but it carried the insidious, constant threat of fire damp, methane gas, a ghostly presence that needed only one spark to erupt into a cataclysm. Tiernan followed Seamus down a lateral chute, their lamps casting dancing, desperate shadows. They passed the door boy, a 7-year-old immigrant child whose job was to sit in the darkness all day, opening and closing a wooden door to regulate the airflow. This was the true monstrous face of American industry. They reached their chamber, a deep recess carved into the black heart of the seam. The first job was to examine the roof timbers, looking for any sign of the squeeze, the slow crushing pressure of the mountain above. Then the real labor began. Tiernan swung his pickaxe, the metallic thwack echoing dully in the confined space. Each chip, each shard of black rock was a piece of his life traded for a pittance. When his chamber was full, the coal would be taken to the breaker above ground, weighed and credited to his account. Except the weight was never honest. "Remember the long strack of 75, Seamus?" asked Tiernan, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. "Aye."
McParland accepted the gold, his mind already spinning the intricate web of his new identity. He knew the risk. If his true identity was discovered, he would not be hanged by the state. He would be gutted by the men he had betrayed. Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, March 1875. "McKenna, another round for the house, on the Chicago man." Tiernan O'Connell, nursing a cheap glass of rye, watched the newcomer, James McKenna, hold court in the smoky back room of Doyle's saloon. McKenna had arrived 2 months ago, flashing money, boasting of his mining experience in the West, and ranting loudly about the thieving Welsh bosses and the tyrant Gowen. He was loud, he was generous, and he was quickly becoming popular. Tiernan was suspicious, too loud, too generous. But many of the older AOH men had taken a shine to McKenna, seeing him as a powerful ally. Tonight, the air was thick with something heavier than smoke. After the usual drunken toasts to Old Ireland and whispered curses against the foreman, Seamus clapped McKenna on the back. "Brother McKenna, you have a fine sense of justice, a Hibernian sense. But justice here takes a different shape than in Chicago." McKenna leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The foremen here are not just thieves, they are murderers. They profit from every cave-in, every bit of bad air. We need to send them a message that hits harder than a black powder charge." Tiernan saw the tension drain from the room. McKenna had used the code. A message. Seamus signaled to a heavily built man, Jack Cahoe, the self-proclaimed king of the Mollies in Schuylkill County. Cahoe was a complex figure, a fervent Catholic, a community leader, a successful saloon owner, and, according to the secret whispers, the final authority on who was to be visited. Cahoe fixed McKenna with a hard, unwavering stare. "Before a man can send a message, he must first prove his loyalty to the secret work. He must prove he is willing to stand in the gap between the poor and the devil's agents." That night, in the dark, dusty cellar beneath Doyle's, Tiernan O'Connell was present as James McKenna took the oath. Tiernan watched as McKenna swore allegiance not just to the AOH, but to the secret society, the phantom army known as the Maguires. He swore to protect his brothers, to fight the oppression of the coal masters, and to carry out the dreadful, anonymous verdicts of the order. Tiernan didn't know that the oath he witnessed was being meticulously recorded, word for word, in a small hidden notebook concealed in McParland's boot. He didn't know that every boast, every threat, and every plan whispered in the dark was a rope being woven to hang his comrades. McParland, the Pinkerton agent, James McKenna, had crossed the line. He was now a Molly Maguire. The stage was set for a betrayal so profound, so effective, that it would cripple the American labor movement for a generation and send 20 men to the gallows. The shadow of the breaker had found its eyes and its ears. Detailed narrative outline, remaining structure. The subsequent chapters would build this astonishing story across the following phases. Part 2, The Secret War, 1875 to 1876. Focus, James McParland's infiltration, the escalation of violence, and the deepening financial crisis for the miners. The infiltration, detailed accounts of McParland's life undercover, the stress of maintaining his persona and his relationship with Tiernan, who remained skeptical. The acts of vengeance, descriptions of the targeted assassinations and acts of arson carried out by the Mollies. The story must maintain narrative tension by presenting these acts as responses to extreme corporate violence. For example, the murder of a miner's child by a mine car, or the unjust eviction of a family in the dead of winter. The Coal and Iron Police. The role of Gowen's private army, the Coal and Iron Police, often called company police, who acted as brutal enforcers, not peacekeepers. Their violence against striking or protesting miners. The Long Strike of 1875. A pivotal moment. The miners strike again, but the economic depression and Gowen's use of the Pinkertons and scabs crush the movement. The miners' desperation forces the Mollies to increase their messages. The discovery of the mole. The Mollies begin to suspect an informant. Tiernan's mounting suspicions of McKenna. A close call where McParland nearly loses his life. Part 3. The Trials and the Verdict, 1876 to 1877. Focus: the arrest, the flawed justice system, and the stunning betrayal that led to the executions. The Roundup. Based almost entirely on McParland's meticulously gathered intelligence, Gowen and the state launch massive coordinated arrests across the county, the shock and fear in the Irish communities. The Unholy Alliance. The astonishing reality that Franklin B. Gowen, president of the Reading Railroad, the Victims Corporation, acted as the chief prosecutor for the state. This fact underscores the total control corporate interests had over the judiciary. The Star Witness, James McParland, a.k.a. James McKenna, takes the stand. His testimony, delivered in a convincing blend of Irish slang and legal detail, becomes the cornerstone of the prosecution. The dramatic reveal of the Chicago man's true identity and the betrayal felt by the defendants, especially Tiernan, who knew him. The hung jury and the convictions. The trials are quick, biased, and often rigged. The defense struggles against the corporate-controlled press, the nativist sentiment against the Irish, and the compelling evidence gathered by the expert spy. Black Thursday. A detailed, somber account of the mass execution on June 21, 1877, in Pottsville and Monkchunk, now Jim Thorpe. 10 men are hanged simultaneously in one county, the largest legal mass execution in U.S. history. The profound sense of injustice felt by the community. Part 4. The Aftermath and the Legacy, 1878 to 1979. Focus: the long-term impact on labor, the debate over the Molly's true nature, and the eventual exoneration. The silence of the mines. Following the executions, the labor movement in the coal region is completely crushed. Gowen reigns supreme, conditions worsen, and the memory of the Mollies is successfully suppressed or demonized in historical accounts. The rise of the UMWA. Decades later, a new, more powerful union, the UMWA, rises, learning lessons from the Mollies' failure, organizing across ethnic lines, and fighting for legal reform. The revisionist history. The historical debate surrounding the Mollies. Were they criminal terrorists or heroic, if flawed, labor martyrs? The evidence of Gowen and McParland exaggerating their crimes for corporate benefit. The pardon. The astonishing final chapter. Over 100 years later, Pennsylvania Governor Milton Shapp grants a full posthumous pardon to John Cahoe, the alleged king of the Mollies, acknowledging the unfairness and corporate influence of the original trials. Tiernan's final reflection. The story concludes with the fate of Tiernan O'Connell, our fictionalized anchor character, now an old man witnessing the pardon, a final, small acknowledgement that the blood shed beneath the shadow of the breaker was not entirely in vain. The fight for justice, though slow, eventually reached the men who died for the promise of a fair day's wage in America.